Well, welcome to another edition of More Bad News, brought to you, as always, by Camel Cigarettes. Take the Camel's Challenge. Smoke Camels for 30 days and see for yourself what a difference Camels can make in your life. The year before I was born, 1946, Camels launched the More Doctors campaign, arguing that if you were experiencing health problems from smoking, the thing to do was to switch to Camels. And then, after you switched to Camels, doctors working for R.J. Reynolds would keep a record of each case and publish the results in authoritative medical journals, which proved conclusively that when smokers changed to Camels, in every case, the irritation either completely disappeared or definitely improved. So try Camels and see how your taste responds to the rich, full flavor of Camel's choice tobaccos. See how your throat reacts to the delightfully cool mildness of Camels. By the way, this is coming from this book, The Cigarette Century by Alan Brandt. We'll hear more of this as the show progresses in later editions. Well, it's been another week of very bad news. This week, the Justice Department executed a search warrant against our former president. But he couldn't even get a military parade like the French had each year on Bastille Day. Why couldn't we have tanks parading through the Capitol like the ones he saw in Paris, except without the cripples? When his White House Chief of Staff, former Marine Corps four-star General John F. Kelly, said those cripples were heroes, Trump said that he didn't like the look. Trump said that he wished his generals were more like Hitler's generals. So when I said the American Republic ended in 2016, I didn't mean that the Republic ended because of Trump's election. His election marked the end of the empire in the same way as World War I marked the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Tsarist Empire. Those empires were in decline for decades before their final collapse. Empires in decline often act in ways that bring their own destruction. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was collapsing because of the various nationalities within the empire: the Poles, the Croats, the Bosnians, the Serbians, the Italians, the Czechs, the Ruthenians, the Slovenes, the Slovaks, the Romanians. They were all pressing for independence. When a Serb nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the Austrians decided to invade Serbia, a suicidal move that brought on World War I and hastened the demise of their empire. This is similar to the US invasion of Vietnam. In an effort to stem the tide of decolonization after World War II, the US fought wars from Vietnam to Afghanistan, in every case undermining America's steadily declining power in Asia. The American Republic ended in 2016 not because of the election of Donald Trump, but as a result of the triumph of neoliberalism, which was embraced by both Democrats and Republicans alike. The American Republic was unique in the world. When the colonies were formed, there was no nobility or landed wealth here. The difference between the United States and Europe throughout most of our history was simple. In Europe, wealth was held in the hands of a small landed aristocracy. So the major difference between the American Republic and the Old World was that you had a small elite who owned all of the land and wealth, and they made up an aristocracy who ruled over a tiny middle class of merchants and craftsmen and a huge class of landless peasants. Here in North America, by contrast, there was a huge middle class. Almost all free white men owned land and were essentially small businessmen. They farmed for a market, not for subsistence. And as the Industrial Revolution kicked in, these middle class independent farmers and merchants saw the growth of corporations like the railroads as a threat to their liberty. And from the late 19th century on, the populist and progressive movements would fight a losing battle against the domination of corporations. Today, concentration of wealth in the US is much more extreme than anywhere in Europe. Wealth in the US is more concentrated than it ever was under King George or Louis XIV. And that is the cause of the demise of the American Republic. Among the first victories of the corporations after the Civil War was the Supreme Court's interpretation of the 14th Amendment, giving corporations status as persons. In December 1882, Roscoe Conklin, a former senator and close confidant of President Chester Arthur, appealed before the Supreme Court of the United States to argue that corporations, like his client, the Southern Pacific Railroad Corporation, were entitled to equal rights under the 14th Amendment. That provision of the Constitution said that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Conklin insisted that this amendment was drafted specifically to protect corporations. Between 1868, when the amendment was ratified, and 1912, when scholars set out to identify every 14th Amendment case heard by the Supreme Court, the justices had decided 28 cases dealing with the rights of African Americans and an astonishing 312 cases dealing with the rights of corporations. At the same time that the court was upholding Jim Crow laws in the infamous cases like Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, the justices were invalidating minimum wage laws, curtailing collective bargaining efforts, and voiding manufacturing restrictions. The 14th Amendment, adopted to shield former slaves from discrimination, had been transformed into a sword used by corporations to strike at unwanted regulation. That comes from a wonderful book by Adam Winkler, We the Corporations, How American Business Won Their Civil Rights, 2018 publication. Well, last week, a graduate student in genocide and Holocaust studies who was studying the history of anti-Semitism in colonial America, came across an unpublished paper of mine drafted in 2012 about Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And since these lectures are focused on colonial America, I thought that I would say a few words about my paper. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God is Jonathan Edwards' most famous sermon. Indeed, it is the most famous sermon in the 18th century and among the most famous sermons ever preached in America. It begins by citing a few words from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 32:35, their foot shall slide in due time. In this verse is threatened the vengeance of God on the wicked, unbelieving Israelites, who are God's visible people and lived under means of grace, and that notwithstanding God's wonderful works for them that he had wrought towards that people, yet they remained, as is expressed in verse 28, void of counsel, having no understanding in them, and that all of their cultivations of heaven brought forth nothing but bitter and poisonous fruit. It was a powerful opening that described the threatened vengeance of God on the wicked, unbelieving Israelites, a people void of counsel, having no understanding in them, a wicked people who, despite all the cultivations of heaven, brought forth bitter and poisonous fruit. It's a deeply troubling image, but the nation that is void of counsel, whose foot shall fall, is not Israel. The words in Deuteronomy refer to the enemies of Israel, those wicked nations that attacked Israel. It is their foot that will fall in due time when the Lord champions his people. That's 35:36. In fact, the 16th century Italian rabbi, the Sforno, read these same words as a warning to Christians who persecuted Israel. That interpretation swiftly met the heavy hand of Christian censors. But as a graduate student at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, I worked with Frederick Jeher, author of A Scapegoat in the Wilderness, The Origins of Anti-Semitism in America, 2014, 1994. Professor Jeher died in 2014. His memory should be for a blessing. He wrote, any comprehensive analysis of anti-Semitism in America must consider the interplay of religious, social, and psychological factors. Of these factors, I believe that religious prejudice, specifically Christian hostility towards Jews, is paramount. Other minorities have been heretical, commercially successful, intellectually accomplished, and prevalently liberal in politics, yet have not repeatedly been the focus of xenophobic and religious paranoia. None of the others gave birth to Christianity, killed its God, and was assigned by Christian doctrine a pivotal role in the cosmic struggle between good and evil. The Jews were uniquely cursed as unrepentant deicides. Jews became the most consistently demonized outcasts in Christendom. The essential anti-Semitic claim is that all Jews are treacherous and murderous conspirators. These anti-Semitic notions were deeply rooted, and in the 1920s, they became a significant factor in the explosion of American anti-Semitism leading up to the 1924 Immigration Restriction Act, which condemned millions of Jews to death in the Holocaust by cutting off immigration to the United States. What we read, what we are reading, of course, here is the Song of Moses, one of the great poetic songs of the Torah. It is a song of warning to Israel to be faithful to God, but it is ultimately a song of triumph and a warning to Israel's enemies, for God will avenge the blood of his servants. In the portion that Edward used for his sermon, God is describing the seed of Sodom, the enemies of Israel who are void of counsel. It is their foot that will slip when God takes vengeance on them. For if God allowed the enemies of Israel to be triumphant, they would believe that they had triumphed over Israel's God. If they were wise, they would realize that the triumph over Israel was God's doing. After all, quote, how can one chase 1,000 or two 10,000 to put 10,000 to flight had not their rock handed them over, had not the Lord given them up? How is it that Edwards came to so misread the text? And why is it that no one in the ensuing 270 years seems to have noticed this glaring misreading? Edwards has taken God's words of rebuke to the enemies of Israel for God's rebuke of Israel. Edwards has taken God's merciless condemnation of the nations and turned it into a merciless condemnation of Israel. Even if Edwards has a reason for reading the text in this peculiar manner, shouldn't some learned man of the cloth or some sectarian critic of the Great Awakening have noticed that the text had been forced into an unnatural position and made to stand in that position as a pillar for his great pronouncement of God's wrath against sinners? When I first discovered this misreading, I wrote to Robert E. Brown, author of Jonathan Edwards in the Bible, 2002, and said, it seemed strange to me, I wrote to him, that Edwards would so misread the text, and I was wondering if anyone in all the centuries since its publication had pointed out that the sermon rests on a misreading of the biblical text. Brown responded, thank you for your interesting observation. I doubt that anyone has called attention to that. In November 2011, I wrote to Avihu Zakkai at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, an Edwards scholar. Zakkai replied, amazing. I'm sending your letter to the Edwards Center at Yale. Great point. And that brings me to the present. What, if anything, are we to make of Edwards' misreading and the subsequent 270 years during which no one seems to have noticed the glaring incongruity? Why has the question never been addressed? How did Edwards come to misread the biblical words, and why is it that no one seems to have noticed the anomaly, despite the fact that it is probably one of the most controversial and widely read sermons in American history, and has surely been read by countless scores of biblical scholars, preachers, and academics? Well, that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, hit the like button and leave a comment. Have a great week, and remember, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette.